性自認含め、男だけど、可愛いものが好き、可愛くありたいと考える人が存在することを本当に驚くほど理解できない文化圏の人ってちょいちょいいるんだよな。
Oh, Bridget. Despite it being many months since the original announcement of the Guilty Gear character into the latest entry, they have had a lot of buzz around them still, appearing on the trending tabs of social media weekly, receiving droves of artwork, and not the least of which, an impressive amount of drama. There's a logical reason for this, mind you. As since I did my initial video covering the situation, we've seen interviews from the devs confirming their intent with said character's identity, then going back on that, and saying it was meant to be ambiguous initially, stating they changed their mind due to the reaction, to then going back on that, presenting trans Bridget was always the plan. And of course, the conflicting statements of the present, as well as the further conflictions when you look to the past, have resulted in a seemingly never-ending debate surrounding the recent retcon. This doesn't even touch on the harassment that's been seen across that social media sphere, or a questionable marketing campaign that only seems to further fuel these other factors. And all of this is what we will be discussing, as over the ensuing months I've been keeping quite busy on this topic in the background, conducting research, translating and finding old interviews and articles, to even having some Japanese ones defending my content on the topic along the way. Some of this led to information that took place 5 months prior to Strive, yet contradicted just about everything the game was set up. So it's no exaggeration to say, there was a wild amount of twists and turns on this journey, much of which I didn't even know previously, as there is a lot of misinformation surrounding this topic, up to and including who is so often attributed as the character's creator, not actually being so. That said, in the spirit of Bridget, I'd like you to consider this video a retcon of my original, as we will be taking steps much like the last time to evaluate why this character meant so much to so many different people, including myself, and how the current trajectory taken has essentially buried over what once was, with a superficial alternative. However, like most stories, we'll have to head back to the beginning. So let's do this one more time.
うちの芸を見てください。
Guilty Gear is quite a historical franchise, with its initial game dating back to 1998, though the first entry of interest to us comes to the turn of the millennium, with Guilty Gear XX. This will be the character Bridget Harkness's first appearance, establishing the basics of their personality and design, primarily with a short opening bio, giving us a peek into their backstory. Here we find Bridget was raised as a girl by his wealthy parents, despite being a boy. This was as a result of a mysterious event that we're not given much insight into, but other than that, we learn the character is a bounty hunter. That's not much, but these breadcrumbs of information catch some interest, don't they? That I want to know more nature is by design. See, I'm not good at fighting games. In fact, I'm quite horrible, but it's still a genre I hold dear because, as I've established in multiple videos, I love characters. I love seeing interesting personalities bounce off or interact with one another. And this is a genre that certainly has interesting personalities in spades. Because there's not a lot of room to tell stories in these games. They're about going from one fight to the next where dudes punch some more dudes. So it often results in developers having to catch interest by the way of both characters' design and personality. These restrictions, more often than not, breed creativity, leading to a lot of captivating characters. And Guilty Gear for a time, I would have considered to be in a tier of my favorites, when it came to this sort of thing. As for people like me, there were tie-in comics and other side content that further elaborated on the details of many fighters in the series. In the case of Bridget, what we came to find out was he was raised as a girl over a superstitious belief that twin boys bring with them bad luck, and as such, one must be sacrificed or exiled. Bridget's parents were not willing to give up one of their children, leading them to raise Bridget as a girl. This event, however, left them with immense guilt over this, leading the parents to make sure their child was properly lavished despite the situation. But, as one could imagine, it wasn't a feeling that would just go away simply because they gave the boy luxury. On the flip side, Bridget too felt guilty for having created the situation to begin with, this guilt being the ultimate catalyst for the events of the first game's story mode, where he would search for a way to prove himself against the superstitions held by the village, by manner of bringing riches and fame to them. Here is where we can get a glimpse at the character's personality. What I've always been particularly fond of is that some aspects of Bridget stand in contrast to his appearance. While there are definitely cutesy things about his personality that can be gleaned from his interactions to certain animations in the games, there are still more typically masculine traits, some of which are shown immediately to the player upon selecting him, such as Bridget acting all smug about not being a woman when confronted with such a declaration from Eno, whereas the young bounty hunter is more than willing to back up his words with a fight. That's not to say he's a completely serious character, far from it. The cross-dresser trope is obviously something that can be ripe for comedy, and there are several interactions throughout the games that take advantage of it. One such instance being the character's third ending, where Johnny is completely devastated that he was hitting on a man, while in contrast, Bridget responds nonchalantly about the whole ordeal. The exchanges are all great stuff. And there brings us back to the appeal of fighting game characters. Their existence isn't designed for grand narratives, they're designed to create fun banter and interactions. Speaking of Bridget specifically, their appearance came from the desire to design a cute character. However, that needed a twist, something to bounce off of for all those dialogue exchanges. As such, the director of the game can be quoted as stating, "While I was creating the characters in Guilty Gear, I had a spot for a cute character. I thought it would be too boring if the character was just cute, so I thought it would be interesting to make the character a guy." And see, the part I really like about this is that the joke here isn't that, whoa, that's a dude in a dress, as many try to claim it was, specifically those people who have never previously interacted with the series until recently. No, Bridget is given a serious in-world reason for cross-dressing that isn't treated as comedic in and of itself, where other characters being confused is the butt of the joke, typically at their expense, not Bridget's. This is another reason I think the character stuck with certain people. A lot of the time, cross-dressing is the joke, and that's fine. But this character is someone who took ownership of the situation, at times taking pride in being a man, and at others, presenting it as an irrelevant fact. But that brings us to the next leg of the story with Accent Core. As we've been discussing, fighting games often aren't concerned with the finer details of story elements, as they focus on interaction. So in this industry, it should not come as a surprise that it's briefly brushed over that Bridget found success as a bounty hunter, perhaps too much, as that business wasn't exactly lucrative anymore by the time we catch up to the character, leaving him with a need to find a new means of making money, which sets him on his new arc of wanting to become an entertainer. This adventure has a few different endings, all of which are of interest to us. The standard one sees Bridget working with Jam in her restaurant, perhaps seeming like a simple ending at first, even if it's a happy one for him. But there's actually something a bit deeper. Up to this point, including the other endings of this game, Route A of Accent Core was the only time Bridget could be seen without his signature handcuff around his waist. Maybe that seems insignificant, but in some ways I think it could have been seen as a representation of the freedom the character achieved by the end of the last game and this new arc. He succeeded in proving himself, and most importantly, moving on to do something he enjoys. The alternative ending, however, has a lot more going on the surface at least. It sees Bridget finally returning to his original village, only to find a concerned uncle to bear the bad news that something has happened to his parents and that his twin brother is missing. A somber ending on its own, to be sure, creating intrigue for the future, but in its original Japanese form, there's also a subtlety to be missed in the ending as well.
うちが僕が絶対に見つけてあげるから。
As you initially heard, when referring to himself, Bridget would often use the more feminine form, uchi, but in this instance, he corrects himself by switching to the masculine boku. There could be a few reasons for this, from simply using it to emphasize his commitment to signaling a greater change in the character. But I think regardless, both this, the last game, and the main ending all come back to the theme of taking ownership of what life deals. And that's where we were left for a decade on the character. Or was it? I mentioned earlier that a lot of Bridget's lore was expanded upon and explained in side material. That fact actually continued to be true past those initial games, but in a place that would seem unlikely. at least for those outside of Japan. It starts with one simple word: pachinko. Which I'm sure just uttering the phrase, despite its simplicity, elicits certain emotions from video game fans. How many times have you been hearing rumors of a new game or celebration of a series just to be disappointed at the realization that the whole event is simply to unveil a new pachinko machine? Too frequently, I imagine. But there is a logical reason for that. It's a lucrative market in Japan, with nearly every popular series attempting to take advantage of said market. And with tough competition comes the need for incentives. This leads to a variety of content being locked behind cabinets. This can be as simple as offering interactions between the player and a fan-favorite character, rewarding them with cute animations for a good role, with others opting to simply recreate iconic scenes, to an increasingly popular trend to lock genuine narrative behind the machines. One notable example for me personally has to do with one of my favorite anime, Re:Zero. Though a date between Subaru and Emilia is referenced throughout the series, it is never actually shown. Most likely, viewers wouldn't think much of this, as sometimes events are hidden for later, or we just don't get to see the specific details of the situation. However, it is an important event for Subaru, so you would imagine the viewer would eventually gain insight into it, instead of it merely being glossed over. And that is in fact the case. You just need to drop a significant portion of money playing the slots on a Re:Zero pachinko machine in Japan, rewarding you with 3 glorious minutes of a very cute, very canon scene, animated by Studio White Fox, that did not make it to any Blu-rays or other releases at this time. Mind you, I'm not defending the practice. It absolutely sucks, but it's important to demonstrate that, much like the prior material used in Bridget's canonization, this is just as valid as any comic or art book, and aligns with the precedent set throughout the industry. So that said, Guilty Gear Vastedge XT is the 5th main entry in the Guilty Gear series, and a visual novel at that. XT puts its focus on Soul on his quest to recover the Flashing Fang, but does have him run into many of the other characters in the series along the way, such as bringing him back into conflict with Bridget due to a bounty that has been put on Soul's head, as it would seem Bridget is back to his old job. Now, obviously the story isn't directly about Bridget, but we do get context to what the character has been up to post-Accent Core. Most importantly, living happily with his identity. Some specific lines, stating his desire to break down the villagers' perceptions, asserting that he's a man, not even wanting to be called cute or referred to as a girl because of that. Seemingly all of his previous traits are still here, with him being even more sure of himself. And this was where, 5 months prior to Strive, the character was truly left. However, in 2022, Bridget would be announced for the newest entry in the series, coming with much celebration, a grin,
No, it's Bridget!
and a host of confusion due to the execution of the character's story that left the Eastern fandom and Western fandom disconnected. The East believing Bridget was still, well, Bridget, referring to him as a guy, while in opposition, the Western base viewed the character as a newly transitioned female. Much discourse arose from this, as you can imagine in the modern state of the internet, to the point where the developers of Strive stepped in to clarify.
We've decoded the intel from the developer's backyard, and it confirms the worst. Somehow, Bridget is a girl now.
Wait, do we believe this?
It cannot be.
This sent the Eastern side specifically into a confused frenzy. When I previously covered this topic, many tried to dismiss this claim as cherry picking, which is a term I'm not even sure most people on the internet who use it understand, as it should be readily apparent from much of what I am and have been showing on screen. This is no small amount of people, with the ones taking issue, ranging from those with big to minuscule internet presence. The dissatisfaction with these changes was massive, to the point where many have chosen to outright ignore them.
I recognize the council has made a decision, but given that it's a stupid-ass decision, I've elected to ignore it.
And we'll be talking about this in more detail soon, but what we really want to focus on first is the uncertain nature in the middle that caused this. as that was by design. That's not speculation on my part either, far from it. While the developer's backyard and other subsequent interviews, such as the late October birthday interviews with Kantano and Daisuke, stated this was always the plan for Bridget's character, thus resulting in many pointing to prior interviews and other past information that said otherwise, most of which we've already covered. However, you don't need to dig into the past to find inconsistencies with these statements. Our answers exist in the present, which makes the sentiment an even clearer farce. See, in that late October TBS interview that no one actually read, Kantano would say the original intention was for Bridget's identity to be ambiguous, stating that even if the team had their own views of the scene prior to this, it was left for the audience to decide. Daisuke followed up by stating they only chose to make an official announcement supposedly due to the drama that had circulated. This is extremely important because not only does it reveal to us how easy it is for them to lie in order to push a new narrative, something a certain recently hated creator is similarly well known for, but also because so many tried to gaslight anyone taking issue with the Bridget change, stating those that called it inconsistent or messy were just, once again, cherry-picking or lying. You don't get to use that term simply because the factual information put forward doesn't align with your preferred perception or worldview. Reality shows us it was all by design. They just double back to appease the side they initially made the change for, when they were called out for it. As, make no mistake, these same interviews have Daisuke mentioning the change was done to be conscious of the overseas market and a strong awareness to global compliance. Now, this revelation doesn't mean the current canon isn't what those in charge ultimately landed in. It's their property. But just as well, it also doesn't mean you should not criticize the writing or bring attention to the obvious inconsistencies. There is a reason the confusion was so widespread to the point that they needed to clarify after all. Thus bringing me to my actual issue, one I hope you come to understand by the end of this video, as my problems have far more to do with the execution and handling of these events than anything else. Because the change could have been done better, or more importantly, the developers could have simply not lied about past intentions, and just said they were doing something different. That said, there's more to take from this interview, as when the interviewer asks about Bridget's design changes, the new outfit is described as an oversized hoodie to hide the width of the character's shoulders, and the size of their arms, as well as also hiding Bridget's Adam's apple. But here's the thing, Bridget does not have those features. This reads like someone Googling transgender to figure out issues a transgender woman would run into, or the result of simply being told them. A hypothesis that has even more weight when you consider just 2 years ago, Daisuke, the one supposedly claiming the character had always been trans, is quoted as saying he didn't even know what transgender was, when asked by a Twitter user to write trans rights on an image of Bridget at the time. An image people now use as a direct lie to push the Bridget was always trans narrative, as it's claimed it was made completely of his own volition, back then, despite literally not knowing what he was writing. Then there's Ozawa, the marketing director, who is also frequently quoted for the trans Bridget narrative. Interestingly, he had this to say in a stream on August 9th. I might as well bring it up. Japan is not used to it yet, the whole gender topic. You might as well learn about it, or maybe you don't really need to learn, but I think it's important to understand. The Guilty Gear tournament winner in 2022 was trans, right? I found out about it on Twitter. This is the first time I learned about the trans flag. I already knew about the rainbow flag, but this is the first time with the trans symbol. So when everyone who's involved with the claim that this was apparently in the works since 2002 seemingly has statements showing how foreign the very concept of Bridget's new identity was a week to 2 years prior, is it really any surprise that we got the interpretation given? Regardless, Bridget was clearly not designed with these traits, despite there being no reason that the character couldn't possess them for this entry, leaning further into the afterthought nature. The same sentiment can be found later in the TBS interview, where it's discussed how Bridget has the transgender symbol on their outfit. I brought attention to this in my original video, but to reiterate, the symbol on Bridget's current headpiece actually stands for androgynous. The transgender symbol is a completely different design. In fact, this specific variant of the androgyne symbol actually means male appearance, meaning it makes even less sense to put it on a transgender female. Again, these design features 100% line up with the idea of the character being meant to be ambiguous. But it is now being used as an active lie to keep up this new narrative. If you ask me, it's just a design downgrade. An affection for nun outfits is certainly a contributing factor here, but you'd be hard-pressed to find someone to say Bridget's original design wasn't unique. It was iconic. The whole big parka look isn't bad on its own, but the best way to illustrate my issue is the fact that his silhouette looks identical to May's new design, to the point where it feels like a cheap copy-paste job. It's lacking, and uninspired, which becomes an even greater shame when you once again consider how it replaced something that used to be distinctly striking. But let's stick to covering inconsistency, as the real kicker here, and perhaps one of the most important things to take from this video, is who designed and wrote Bridget initially. In a past video, I referred to Guilty Gear as Daisuke's baby, and that's true. This man has had his hands on every aspect of the series at some point, from voice acting, character design, music, all the way up to directing. But it should not at all be shocking to hear he didn't create every aspect of these games, maybe even less than you think in some areas. The original artist responsible for designing Bridget is Emiko Iwazaki, who would get her start working in the industry by way of this very series, before unfortunately leaving Arc System in 2011 due to the sexist treatment she received within the company. She was even responsible for Battle Fantasia, the very first Arc System game to utilize the 2.5D technology that has become synonymous with the company. She's certainly someone worth recognizing in relation to both this character and Arc System's success, and one can only wonder why her name has been buried in relation to both. However, she was only half the equation for Bridget, whereas Norimitsu Kaiho is credited for the character's actual writing. Many might take that as me attempting to discredit Daisuke, but he was still the director. As essentially the captain of Guilty Gear's ship, one would assume he's still an authority. I wouldn't disagree with that. I've clearly used the man's statements myself to prove my own points.
But a lot of fighting games already had the token cute character, so we wanted to have something that was unconventional. So that's why we have a cute character that's a guy.
And I was originally planning to end this section by saying he had no small part in the creation of the character. It was a collaborative effort that he surely signed off on and was involved within the process. But that was something I wrote before research began. I don't think that's fully true now. I believe it really was minuscule. As, do you want to know who is now seemingly aiming to discredit Daisuke's involvement? Well, Daisuke himself. In a 4Gamer interview, Daisuke went on record to clarify that he had nothing to do with Bridget's previous writing, seeming to want to disconnect himself from that aspect of prior games, despite previous statements contradicting such a sentiment. So going by historical fact and Daisuke's own words, he really shouldn't be attributed with the creation of Bridget. Narratively speaking, what's going on here is starting to feel similar to other modern brands like Star Wars, where something iconic becomes taken over with once beloved characters ruined for some form of marketing, or just because the new head doesn't care for the old. I'm not the only one who seemingly came to this conclusion either, as many have pointed out how insulting it is to take the character Bridget, who originally was forced to live as a girl by the matter of circumstance, whereas his story initially very much evolved into proving the villagers wrong and living as himself, to the narrative being twisted and contorted to the exact opposite scenario, with the villagers ending up being right, and the essential grooming of this character, as many have called it, is treated as a positive message, all by someone who wasn't responsible for the original envisionment of this character, and one who proceeded to lie about those original intentions. Admittedly, it's certainly not a situation exclusive to this instance or series. One of the reasons I fluctuate more towards Japanese works as opposed to the ones made in America is projects tend to be spearheaded by one individual. But as I've noted in the past, they're not unbeholden to this issue, especially with companies like Arc System or Square that have such a large Western focus and develop with the goal of the widest audience possible. In fact, one of the many stories that made me feel so strongly on this point is related to a Japanese franchise, and it's a story I'd like to indulge for a moment. Like many others, I've always been a big fan of Pokemon, but it's a series that holds the tale of Takashi Shudo, a Japanese scriptwriter and novelist who was the original creator of Lugia. Shudo originally envisioned Lugia as a motherly figure, heavily connected to life on Earth itself, and as such designed the creature with female characteristics and personality, while still attempting to represent both genders to give the creature an air of androgyny. However, when it came time for the Pokemon's movie appearance, much of this was changed. Shudo only found out from a commercial, in fact, and can be quoted as feeling like he wanted to die, proceeding to turn to drugs and alcohol as crutches in the coming years. Lamenting such regrets of letting this happen to a character he had initially poured so much love into, and wishing he could have fought harder for his vision, a sentiment held right up until his death. That's not to say Iwazaki, Kai-Ho, or anyone else would feel as emotionally compromised by changes made in Strive, but Shudo is one of the billion examples that shines a light on the reality of situations like these. The character had a clear message put into them, and seeing it lied about that this new path was always the plan, despite that being verifiably false, is plainly insulting to both fans of the character and anyone involved with the original process. Perhaps that's a good segue though, as despite all this talk of the background elements surrounding Strive, we have yet to talk in detail about the game's story itself. Let's start by properly establishing what a retcon is. Perhaps the biggest debate you will find amongst the drama surrounding Bridget is how defenders of it will claim the change isn't a retcon. However, that clearly comes from a place of not knowing what a retcon is, much like a prior term we discussed. As while it is most often seen as a bad thing, calling something a retcon doesn't mean you disagree or dislike a change. A retcon is the act of adding a piece of new information that imposes a different interpretation on previously described events, typically used to facilitate a plot shift or account for an inconsistency. That just fundamentally is what happened here, whether you agree or not. So with that established, let's move on. Bridget's story this go around starts off with a far more self-conscious Bridget, questioning how they are living their life. This conundrum ends in two different ways. Unlike past games, characters in Strive don't have multiple endings, with much variance. Instead, the earlier endings, resulting from failure, see the characters' arcs ending preemptively, often leaving them feeling incomplete, or contrasting a true conclusion. Some would even compare these early ends to that of a bad ending. In Bridget's case, in this vulnerable state, the character would meet Gold Lewis early on, an in-universe Fed with potential ties to an agency that has previously in Guilty Gear lore described Bridget's unique situation as something that can be used to manipulate him. Keep that in mind. Whereupon meeting him in the game, Lewis immediately refers to Bridget as a girl and continues to do so throughout the coming story mode, accidentally. Upon losing later fights in this mode, Gold Lewis will jump in directly to assist both the player and Bridget, ultimately leading to the character coming to the conclusion that they're a girl now. Alternatively, if you win all of the fights in the story mode, the ending has Bridget with Kai where he gives a speech stating that you shouldn't change for anybody, no matter what others think or the expectations put on you. Whereas Bridget in response, instead of asserting themselves as a woman, will then state they will be themselves, no matter what others' expectations are going forward. This immediately gives a gander into why there was so much confusion upon the DLC's release, and how exactly the writers of Strive went about the initial intention of making the character ambiguous. As stated, the try again route for many characters sees things unfinished. There are even examples like Axel's, where he literally runs off, leaving the story incomplete, as well as other examples like with Baiken's, where she meets Nago Ryuki for the first time and he flees in fear. However, in the successful version of this event, she manages to stop him from fleeing, ultimately resulting in her arc reaching its conclusion, having found what she was looking for. So in Bridget's case, it creates a perfect contrast where losing sees them just agreeing with the person making assertions of their identity throughout the story, and then the true route where they decide to live as themselves, even if it's a complete retread, handled far worse than Bridget's earlier stories. From the Japanese perspective, this was also the generally accepted view, with many going as far as to even take the "I'm a girl" line as a declaration of being girly, a common trope in Japanese media. Therein still lies my main issue with this story, however. I mentioned many times that one of the reasons I like this character so much was their personality, as I'm a man that loves contrast. So having a cutesy character possess a smug or uncaring side really gels with me. Previously, we saw Bridget going in the complete opposite direction, where he would correct others who viewed him as a woman, wanting to distance himself from the female identity placed on him, and instead building his own, with some examples we have yet to mention, like him asking Biken to help in becoming unladylike, given the character's brutish personality. However, the new iteration we're seeing in Strive just stands in complete contrast to the personality that was present only a few months ago in Universe. Strive making Bridget sheepish, unconfident, and yet weirdly vain at times, going from not caring what others thought in previous games to tee call me cute type lines filling their dialogue. In a similar manner to how they said the character has traits like an Adam's apple or broad shoulders, so much of the personality feels copy-pasted from a Google search. Now their in-game bio mentions that they hate items like mushrooms and other such phallic objects. Because get it? It vaguely looks like male genitalia, so of course it would make them feel uncomfortable. They're a girl now. Google said trans women don't like their genitalia. It's all so weak. Before, this part of the bio simply stated the character didn't like muscles, something they did not possess, and stood as yet another example of how Bridget owned their own existence, being happy with who he was, not ashamed of parts of themselves, which this new bio implies. Bringing us to the second half of this. The duality in the endings was most likely a result of how we discussed the aim to make the character's identity ambiguous initially, a goal that makes even more sense when you examine the development choices that went into Strive as a whole. See, many things about this game were compromised to reach the widest audience possible by basically every metric. This can be seen at the very core of the game. Even as someone who is not at all competitive, I dropped Strive immediately on console and was only willing to give it a second chance on PC with Bridget's DLC due to early excitement. But the foundation of the game is just so watered down, mechanically, in an attempt to appeal to that widest audience. The developers even stated their goal is to make a fighting game that you don't need to practice. What is appealing about that? It's not that this is a rarity among modern fighting games, mind you. Many try and many fail as a result, in terms of fan reception. Even in cases like Street Fighter V, where they sell well due to fighting game players being peak consumers, that find the need to always buy and support products they shit on, because it's still the current running tournament game. Though, perhaps more pertinent to our discussion, is something that the small group that champions Strive currently is happy to sweep under the rug. See, when the game was initially released, it had references in its glossaries to Taiwan, Tibet, and other nations, that were then censored to appease the Chinese government in a future update, a common practice among companies trying to portray a progressive image. While this was once a well-known facet of the game, there are actually some further oddities that relate to it that aren't so well known. Testament, another character that could be described as a femboy, actually has some concept art depicting them as more masculine, showing a completely different direction for the character. Like Bridget though, they decided this character was no longer a guy for Strive, meaning they took the both and only characters that could be considered feminine men and made them women, or at least not men. Coincidentally, feminine men around this time also became banned as a thing you could portray in media in China. Am I alluding that this was ultimately one of the reasons Bridget was changed? Well, no. I certainly think it could be a contributing factor and is some food for thought. However, my personal takeaway is that it leans far more into the whole appealing to as many people as possible mindset. It should be stated that Bridget was not popular anywhere outside of Japan. To speak in specifics, we can look at Guilty Gear's popularity poll, where he would rarely ever squeeze a numbered placement in the West. Conversely, he would sit at number 1 overseas consistently, to the point where he has inspired many characters in the ensuing decades, from Bridget in Disgaea 2, which, side note, was also censored and retconned, but just in the English relocalization, to famously Boku no Pico, or smaller references throughout anime. Bridget was sort of a culture icon for Japan, while in contrast, it wasn't just Bridget's low popularity numbers in the West. There's proof that he was actively hated when it comes to those FGC fans specifically, with many outright disliking the character, thinking them offensive.
No, it's Bridget!
So Bridget from the get-go, as they were, was the perfect marketing tool for Japan, with Kantano specifically stating the character was picked due to the, and I quote, sluggish sales in Japan. But it remained that Bridget was not popular in the fighting game scene of the Western world. There were exceptions to this, of course. Some non-FGC brain players and many other weebs across the internet, myself included, would drive him to some niche popularity. But that's not who they needed to grab, so something needed to be done to change that, making this character a marketing juggernaut for both sides of the world. Now, put yourself in the shoes of these devs that were gunning for wide appeal. You had a character largely popular, with one of your most financially viable regions, yet he was unliked to the point of being deemed offensive by your other major region, except the reason he was offensive was the key. This being that he was a cross-dressing boy. And funny enough, in my talks and research, a lot of Japanese users actually believed Bridget was considered offensive due to Christian beliefs, referencing the fact that he was cross-dressing as a nun, which I think hilariously shows the disconnect some might have who aren't as cued into the drama surrounding the character in the Western world. However, the true reason is reflective of a modern held belief that cross-dressers are offensive to the transgender movement. And perhaps confusingly so, these same characters are labeled as transgender women themselves by those individuals. No matter if they're just a boy trying to express themselves in a different way, or simply end up in the situation through a matter of circumstance. Bridget has no shortage of both of these throughout his tenure, with many examples of people since the announcement using it as an opportunity to say the devs are correcting some wrong of the past, or that this is just one stop on their goal to change many franchises in such a way. Now, it goes without saying how backwards this all is, but the point here is, in the modern Western environment, a change of this sort would clearly be profitable. In fact, the marketing campaign leading up to was essentially Bridget's re-gender reveal seemed perfectly manufactured for the West, having that live stream with Ozawa, saying they were learning more about the trans movement, as well as Daisuke being quoted as saying they believe the society wasn't ready for the trans story until now. An absolutely ridiculous statement to come from a Japanese developer, considering the myriad of trans stories in both animated and video game forms of media within the country. So if you accept this, then Daisuke is a coward who was only willing to enact this wish once it was guaranteed to print money. Or it's the conclusion we've continued to arrive at, that his statements are dishonest. There is something that makes this make sense, however. Once you realize that Strive's development coincided with the establishment of Arc System's American branch, or to be more exact, Californian branch, a branch that was founded on statements about steering games for a global audience, further bolstering the likeliness that this was all designed around appealing to specifically Americans. And it really worked out, didn't it? For the first time, the FGC scene itself seemed ecstatic over this character. In fact, this was probably the closest Guilty Gear had come to some mainstream attention since they made headlines back when they censored themselves for China. All of this buzz centering around the fact that the character was a girl now. You even had instances like the English branch of Pixiv, where for Bridget's announcement article, they added an entire section about trans visibility to the translation of the article, in a desperate attempt to bring attention to their gender, when the reality was, the original article had only talked about the character's physical design while showing off artwork that, even in the misrepresented English version, was still tagged male. I think it's inarguable that no matter your feelings, this was used as a marketing tool, and such an effective one at that. You began to even see the opinions of the character flip on their head in real time. When speaking of the FGC, I've been using a clip from player Gecko Squirrel, screaming and booing the announcement of Bridget, and you're probably wondering why I've chosen to highlight this guy specifically.
No, it's Bridget!
Well, simply put, he's the perfect example of this discussion. As the second Bridget was said to be trans, despite his prior views, he proceeded to make an entire video saying the character is beautiful and singing their praises. This is merely one example of so many people like this, and it's why I said in my original video that you're going to see nearly every Western creator follow along with this narrative, because even the ones who hate the character know what the correct response is, all while the original fans have to endure constant gaslighting stating that we were never truly fans, and we're only feigning concern now because of ulterior motives we apparently have. Give me a break. It's gotten so bad that this transparent marketing push isn't even fully working on those it's aiming for, as ever since Bridget's release, the Guilty Gear team has completely sidestepped the promotion of other characters, whether it's the series mascot or other new additions, instead continually choosing to push Bridget, giving them multiple figure announcements every month, making them the face of every social media post, every tournament announcement, every crossover. You'll even find the hashtag Bisket Stans pointing out how forced it is on occasion. Their neglect is so extreme that even Biken, the character that was #1 in the polls for nearly every nation that wasn't Japan, consistently does not see anywhere near the same treatment. Just a singular figure despite being in the game for over a year longer than Bridget. And the social media presence in comparison is non-existent. As I said, even the mascot plays second fiddle now, resulting in the people who play these games, even the ones who accepted this retcon, not being happy with this. What's going on here is obvious to everyone. And as someone who was one of those prior fans, it sucks to see. However, one has to ask, from the perspective of the franchise, is it even worth it? Well, looking at the numbers, Strive has received a consistent drop-off post Bridget's announcement, with very few recovery periods to speak of. That's not to say it's strictly because of Bridget, it's, as I said before, though Strive sold well initially due to marketing and tournaments, long-term player retention is going to plummet when you water down your game for the lowest common denominator, as even when it was the main event at EVO. Coming into the tournament, its Steam numbers were the lowest they had ever been up to that point, and immediately returned to dipping when its time in the spotlight passed, while other games from the show such as Tekken continued to grow. Hell, XR'd a few months back got an announcement that it would receive rollback netcode, resulting in its player and view count shooting over Strive's. The game didn't even get that netcode, yet players were just so hyped over the prospect of a better game in the series having a decent online experience, even if the environment doesn't stay that way due to the very nature of it being an older game. The sentiment of wanting something better is clear. So, I guess to answer my own question, it depends on if a short-term monetary gain is worth it for the devaluation of a brand or the legacy of a product. And unfortunately, there are many that will find that trade-off to be worth it. That's not the case for everyone though, and we can see the sentiment also present in the Arc System ecosystem, as 11 days after the Bridget drama, Toshi Michimori, the creator of BlazBlue, left the company. While the specifics of why will probably never fully be known, he did leave on his own accord, and I think it's a fair assumption that it mostly came due to the direction the company has been going, as Mori's dislike for the Western scene has been pretty public, to the point where gaming websites made articles crying and pissing themselves about it, all on top of his own series being relegated to gotcha hell. From the outside looking in, Mori is a man who wants to chase his passions, and I don't think Arc System was offering those passions anything anymore. This brings me to what will ultimately be our final stop today, and it's a facet that is connected to every other point we've been over, and that would be the harassment, specifically that which has been directed at Japanese fans. As discussed, Bridget was the most popular character in Japan. It was a given that upon the announcement, he would immediately receive a variety of fan works, and this would usually be tagged as boy or even more often, Otokonoko, which translates to male daughter, a tag for Japanese cross-dressing male characters. These artists as a result will receive death threats, slurs, calls for doxing, and generally just had hate flung toward them by the group of people proclaiming themselves as the good guys. Most of these creators probably being blindsided by what they even did wrong. However, this should really come as no surprise to anyone these days, with many recent controversies following a similar narrative. The most notable of these is what surrounded Hogwarts Legacy, which let's detour for a moment, as I promise it'll make sense why later. In this situation, we saw huge streamers like Silver Veil, who had her entire family doxxed over simply playing a video game, to even more extreme cases like Pikami, a VTuber who had originally found comfort in VTubing because throughout her life she was picked on for her physical differences. This career path gave her some place of belonging, and yet because she had shown interest, like the many before her, in merely playing the latest, most popular game on the market, she was harassed to the point of no longer feeling comfortable in this place she initially carved for herself. Someone who most likely had no idea as to even why all these horrid things were coming her way. Much like many artists who just wanted to draw a picture of a character who brought them joy, yet were bullied into submission by these people. And as the events unfolded, all those activists, big YouTubers, political streamers, and websites all played defense, saying those individuals were never harassed, or putting the blame on those who were bringing attention to said harassment. Every single time. In Pickamy's case specifically, these people will do everything in their power to say the harassment has nothing to do with her retiring the Pickamy moniker. Despite in her final stream with that moniker, she casually explained she was hoping for 1 million subs before the end of the year, something that she never achieved because the following stream, which had been announced, was cancelled due to the harassment, which then proceeded to her retiring the Pickamy avatar and a frantic announcing of collabs to send her off. Apparently, she now voices a new model, and people are using this to say that negates the criticism of what happened. But the issue was never that she quit or how she responded. Neither of those matter in actuality. It was the fact that she was harassed to such a ridiculous degree. It's like this: just because you didn't succeed in ruining this girl's life or anyone else's, doesn't mean we forget everything that happened. That's why I'm bringing her story up. It's not that I even particularly cared for the individuals I'm speaking on. What I care about is that this happens to anyone, where despite how huge this situation was, it, as always, had been followed by the absurd lengths to astroturf any accountability when certain groups are involved. The vile things I've seen are numerous. They don't even stop at the individual level either, often crossing over into xenophobic territory, when in this case, they instead target the entire nation of Japan as transphobic, or simply state that they are porn addicts, so of course they would want the character to be a boy, which is a conundrum I want to take a moment to dissect, as this whole "they're just porn addicts" angle of dismissal is used very often against anybody taking issues with the current trajectory of the character. But if you actually look at the numbers, what you find is in the 20 years of this character being a crossdresser, he had literally less than half of his current not safe for work post created, meaning it became over doubled in the few months the West considered them trans, according to an English site's statistics. You know the one. And further, there was no shortage of posts spreading across social media fetishizing the desired change. Am I saying that's an issue? Not really. Create any media you want, but this idea that the people who cared previously were all strictly porn addicts is probably not an argument you want to make when there's so much factual proof to the contrary. And to continue on the topic of sexualization, many compare Bridget's situation to that of grooming, to the point of parallels being made to the real-world example of David Raymer. However, in response, many are quick to dismiss such accusations, and while I think our coverage has already done a fair job of showing how the situation can be viewed in that way, there is one last aspect of the grooming angle I'd like to discuss. It deals directly with those naysayers. We've established that many of these people try to force the transgender identity on any character that fits outside of gender norms, but this happens to real people as well, myself included. As such, you can probably come to the conclusion that this is why I take an even greater interest in this topic. But furthermore, after expressing my views previously, do you know the biggest video that was championed as a takedown on my own was made by a woman who, when I was coming off my troubled teen years, would literally refer to me publicly as an egg, a term for a closeted trans girl, only use female pronouns when speaking about me, and consistently insist I was trans despite my continued public statements that would say this was something that made me uncomfortable. It's not as if that was a singular case. Since that video, I've had new people do the same thing, between sending threats or fabricating stories and conversations with the express purpose of sidestepping my criticism. Seriously, it's not as if I'm making an analogy here. It was literally the same people. And even ignoring my own personal experience, next to artists being targeted, feminine guys seem to be on the blunt end of so much of the harassment from these users, where they take pleasure and celebrate their hatred. I think that tells you a lot about those that try to discredit the fans that have developed a distaste for the direction taken with Bridget. We're told we're the ones with ulterior motives when we defend this character's origin, but how many times are these hashtag Bisket Stans shown to have literally no knowledge of the series, never play these games, have zero interest in the content otherwise, as well as constantly being caught with their pants down as they insist they somehow are an authority on this topic? I think that's what a lot of this stems from. I've covered it in the past and even briefly mentioned it already, but we constantly see movements to remove traps, femboys, and just cute male characters from media, in favor of making them trans, with situations up to localizers literally attempting to create these changes against the author's wishes. So while it's not something I find the need to get into detail here, at least on a grand scale, as you can watch my other videos specifically if that interests you, but the point is, that's gross. It's a fun character trope for some, and for others it's something they legitimately identify with. The Bridget Retcon just feels like it's pandering to that specific demographic that wants to take away those characters, and that response only further cements the point. This also shows us the biggest form of irony here. The same people constantly insisting that Astolfo, Gwendolyn, Venti, and even characters like Link are actually trans due to ignorance of the author or some other delusion, are saying you should respect the wishes of Daisuke. Ignoring the fact that we've gone over Daisuke's questionable authority, it becomes obvious that they don't care about a creator's intent when you look at these issues across the board. They care about using it, in this situation, as a tool. So no, I'm not going to care if people still refer to Bridget as a guy. Why should I bend over backwards for the people who would never in a million years do the same for the other side of the aisle? As for myself though, Bridget being a girl is still the current canon of what Arc System is producing, and consistent with my views, I acknowledge that, instead of relying on some delusional idea like headcanons. However, it's also similar to how other modern properties deteriorate over reiteration after reiteration, resulting in many fans' disinterest in later works. And as so many other things, that's where I am with Bridget. The thoughts of what came before will be what sticks in my mind. You know, years ago on stream, I said if they announced the character for Strive, I'd pick the series back up again and go cosplay Bridget at tournaments, going all out into becoming the guy for him. But it doesn't feel like that character ever truly came back. This new version of Bridget feels completely removed from what was, and the lies and gaslighting surrounding their past just goes to further show that the ones in charge ultimately want to replace him with something different. But that really just sums up the entire video, doesn't it? That said, things are finally coming to a close. I want to say I made this video for a few reasons, many of which have been on full display since the start. With my original coverage, many misrepresented my points, saying that I was fabricating my arguments, the proof, the inconsistencies, to the response from people overseas, all from individuals who never cared about this series until a superficial pin was put on it. So yes, a motivator for this video was to prove a point, but even more than that, on a personal level, it was just a way to say goodbye to an old friend, cataloging the importance of what used to be here. Because despite the best efforts of many to harass or silence those that speak out, I don't think those things deserve to be lost. Well, that's the end of the video. As always, if you made it this far, I'd appreciate it if you'd consider subscribing, liking the video itself, becoming a YouTube member, or supporting me more directly on Patreon, like the good people on screen right now. Other than that though, I'll see you next time.